Hi, good morning. Welcome to our lecture for today. Our lecture is entitled I Need Space. Sa mga may naaalala dyan at kung madami kayong feelings regarding this phrase, pasensya na kung merong matitrigger. So it's just a very catchy phrase and I decided to make this the title. So it's all about space and how it is defined. So our lecture will tackle the following principles regarding space. And if you don't know me yet, I am Architect Kyrene Felix Pahela. I will be teaching you this topic. So first, let us define what space is. Space is defined as a continuous expanse which is free, available, or unoccupied. So pag sinabi nating space, walang laman, it's supposed to be blank, and it's also defined as the dimensions of height, depth, and width within which all things exist and move. So nung elementary pa tayo, kung naaalala pa natin, okay, naalala nyo pa ba nung elementary pa kayo? So, ano ang definition ng matter? Matter is anything or it's something that has occupies space and has mass. By that definition, may kita natin na space is something that we can occupy. Ibig sabihin, wala pa siyang laman beforehand. Another definition is some of the adjectives used to describe space are una, free, available, unoccupied, like I said kanina, walang laman, wala pang laman, pwede pang lagyan ng content, or limitless, it is infinite, empty, blank, and unbounded. So it's just a free infinite space. Yun yung pinaka-basic na definition of space. So, pagdating sa art, sa architecture, madalas nating naririnig yung negative space and positive space. So, ang una natin nakikita dito, right, in this figure here, yung kulay black, makikita natin yung profile ng mukha ng babae. In some images, yung white meron ding ibang form na marirecognize. For example, yung mga nakikita natin na parang mga visual na tricks or ano yung una mo nakita dun sa picture, anong animal ba, and then it's just a compilation of different animals, and then it has it's supposed to say something about your personality, pero simply put, negative space and positive space, pinaka often natin nararanasan yung background that is perceived usually as negative space, and yung form na dinagdag natin doon sa space, it becomes what we know as positive space. For example, pag nagdo-drawing tayo sa isang papel na blanco, usually ang papel natin whatever color it may be, no? So yung paper natin or yung canvas natin, it can be the negative space, and then yung drawing na dinagdag natin, that is the positive space. So sa architecture, we can draw parallel to this definition. Okay, so i-review lang natin our last activity sa class natin. Ito yung mga instructions as a review. So the students were asked to pick 3 objects within the house kasi nga quarantine tayong lahat ngayon, kaya hindi kayo pwedeng lumabas. So, you were instructed to find 3 objects. And then, you are supposed to arrange the objects according to itong instruction na to. Object number 1 is inside, within, or on object number 2. So, bahala kayo how you are supposed to interpret that. While object number 3 is near objects number 1 and 2. Again, pag sinabi nating malapit, depende pa rin yan sa inyo. So, we're going to submit photos of the 3 objects as arranged according to this instructions, and then pwede nyong i-take yung picture sa aerial view or above the 3 objects, or kung ano yung applicable na angles, and then i-upload nyo dun sa thread that was originally posted. So I chose 3 examples. from those 50 plus submissions. Sorry, I will not be able to feature all of them. Although lahat iba-iba yung interpretations, and there are many interesting interpretations of this. So here's how we can explain it and relate it to architecture later on. So this is the first example. So you have object number 2 and 3 as positive forms in a negative space. Ang tinutukoy ko negative space dito, yung pinagpatungan niya. Hindi ko sure if this is a table or a bed. Pero may fabric kasi dun sa taas. So, given the negative space, pinatong niya doon yung tatlong objects. And then, isa pa makikita natin dito is una, yung distance ng object number 2 doon sa object number 3. So, distance sila, pero yung arrangement nila, the two are parallel. So, pwede nating sabihin kapag, for example, may nagtanong sa'yo ng direksyon. Okay, tinanong ka, naglalakad ka sa kalsada, for example, may nagtanong sa'yo, Miss, alam mo ba kung saan makikita yung ganitong building? For example, alam mo ba kung nasan yung Mercury Drug? Okay, so ikaw being familiar dun sa area, you can answer like this. Pwede mong sabihin na, Kuya, doon po sa tapat ng 7-Eleven. Okay, so there we can, yung direction, makikita natin na parallel yung dalawang buildings or yung dalawang establishments. So you can easily define yung mga objects depende kung ano yung katapat nila or yung katabi nila. Okay, so dito, ganun yung ginawang interpretation wherein object number 2 and object number 3 are parallel or somewhat aligned. Hindi nga lang pantay na pantay, but you can see yung alignment. Okay, another thing that we can observe here is that object number 1 o yung figurine na maliit is contained within object number 2. Object number 2 is a wooden box. Okay, so pag nakita natin dito, nagkaroon na ng boundary yung space niya. Kung saan nandun na siya sa loob ng object number 2 or yung box. Okay, so itong mga lines dito, yung naka-hidden lines dito, tinrace lang natin yung space or yung spatial volume niya doon sa loob kung nasaan siya naka-enclose. So yung mga vertical boundaries kagaya ng walls ng box, it defines the form ng spatial volume sa loob. Okay, so yun yung pinaka-bounds ng mismong space within object number 1. And then here is our next example. So itong example naman na to, itong tatlong objects, mukhang nakapatong siya sa isang plane or mukhang nasa table siya nakapatong. And then, pansinin natin ulit yung distance between object number 2 and object number 3. Kung makita natin dito that they are very close in proximity. Magkalapit na magkalapit lang sila. Okay? There's very little space in between. Okay, ano pa makikita natin dito? Object number 1, which is itong action figure ni Iron Man, ay nakakontain inside object number 2. But kahit naka-enclose siya from all sides and with the exception of yung pinakataas na opening, dahil dun sa material na ito ay glass or transparent, visible pa rin siya from the outside. And the outside environment is also visible from the inside of this glass container. Okay? So, sa architecture, makikita natin yung application yan. When gusto natin na parang indoor-outdoor feel, wherein yung outdoors included sa indoors, kahit na protected ka from the outdoor elements, you can use materials like this. Isa pang mapansin natin dito, object number 1 is raised on an elevated base. So, mamaya i-discuss natin yan further. So, nagbigay ito ng additional na height sa kanya, itong elevated base na ito. So, here is our third example. Ano yung una nyo napansin dito sa picture na to? Dito sa tatlong objects. So, for me, una ko napansin yung pinakamalaki in size, which is itong digital clock. Pero, aside from its size, nakita ko rin yung color nung characters nung clock doon sa loob. So, nag-contrast siya dun sa white na background, white na color ng mga objects, and yung isang figurine dito sa gilid is transparent. So, yun yung nagkaroon ng contrast, nagkaroon ng emphasis. Then, tingnan natin yung ibang objects. Again, may proximity siya, close proximity to object number 3. Pero, magkakalapit lang. And you can also see na naka-angle sila towards each other. It's the way na naka-compose itong dalawang objects na to. Now, let's look at object number 3. Object number 1. So, naka-elevate siya. By being on top of object number 2. Okay, mamaya i-discuss natin yung elevated base plane. But, ang makikita natin dito, si object number 2 is not necessarily contained. Nakaangat lang siya. Pero pag tinanong natin, nasan si object number 1 o itong object na ito nasa itaas, may tuturo mo andun sa taas. So, you can easily pinpoint the direction kasi nga it's mounted on something. So, object number 3 is also mounted on an elevated base. Kagaya nung action figure sa past natin na example. So, makikita natin dito, just because of the way that these objects are angled, itong digital clock and itong figurine, yung space between them are partially enclosed. So, makikita natin dito, medyo nag-cove siya doon sa empty space na yon. And it can also define an empty space by having itong somewhat degree of enclosure dun sa gilid, kahit pa dalawang side lang yan. So, mamaya titingnan natin yung iba pang examples nito. Okay, let's define form and space. So, sa architecture, pag in-apply natin itong mga definition na to, architecture realized as form occupies and defines space. So, form provides boundaries and definition to space. Kasi nga, without form, space is blank. It's empty. Volume of space contained within the form of mass. So, yan, that's why we are building. Para nga merong degree ng containment or enclosure in which we are protected from outside elements. And for that, kailangan natin ng form that will be effective doon sa space wherein we're going to build the buildings. Okay. So, what are the forms that define space? So, we have horizontal elements and vertical elements. Okay? So, para so that we will be sheltered from the outdoor elements and so that we can survive and function as human beings, kailangan natin itong mga elements na ito. So, discuss natin. Una, horizontal elements. Pag sinabi natin horizontal, sana wala nang nalilito dito kung paakyat patayo ba siya or pahiga. Ang horizontal po ay pahiga. Okay? So, makikita nyo dito sa photo na to, nilagyan ko siya ng horizontal lines. At iisa-isahin natin, ano bang base plane, ano bang elevated base plane, what is a depressed base plane, and overhead plane. So, una, horizontal base plane is a horizontal plane laying as a figure on a contrasting background. So, it defines a simple field of space. Hindi siya nakaangat, it's on the same level as the other planes. So, for example, dito, makita natin na itong pathway na to going to the front door of the house is almost at the same level as the grass. So, pagdating dito, yung lawn, ma-identify natin agad, nagbago na yung texture. Itong plane na to, ibig sabihin, pathway yan. So, pag gumagawa tayo ng plano, importante na may linya yan. So, galing ka sa street and then going to the building, meron kang pathway, alam natin na dadaanan yun ng tao. Or meron kang lines in your plan or yung site development plan mo na nakalagay, okay, so itong line na to, hindi siya naka-raise from the ground, pero ibig lang sabihin nito, from the grass, nagbago ako, nakasemento na to kasi dito magiging parking. So it's very important, pag gumagawa tayo ng plano, lahat ng mga linya na nilalagay natin dyan, may ibig sabihin. So pag nilinya mo yan sa plan, it's either naka-raise siya or it's just nag-change ka ng ground cover or ng flooring. So pagdating dito, that's exactly the case. Kumbaga, dinefine lang niya yung border nung pathway. And yung grass. Kasi if you can imagine, mahirap maglakad sa grass pag umulan, like what happens frequently dito sa Pilipinas, magpuputik ka. So pathways like this are important. So pag yun yung distinction ng base plane. So it distinguishes yung plane and kung anong usage nun from the other planes or from the rest of the space. So tingnan naman natin yung elevated base plane. So it's a base plane but it is elevated. So it's a horizontal plane elevated above the ground plane. So na-establish na natin first ano muna yung level ng ground, and then from the ground iaangat lang siya. So it establishes vertical surfaces along its edges to that reinforce the visual separation between its field and the surrounding ground. So hindi siya nakalutang. May kita natin, meron tayong mga steps dito. Yung mga steps na yon hindi lang plain na nakalutang, kundi meron din siyang makikita mo yung finish nung rise nung stairs, or pwede rin itong wall na to. So sa taas niyan there is an elevated plane, pero naka-close off itong wall na to. Hindi siya nakalutang na walang vertical na plane nakasama. So ang elevated base plane, it is important na meron ding vertical plane that defines it, yung pagkaangat niya from the ground. Okay, so that's one example. An elevated base plane, depende pa yan. Pwede mong naka-raise lang siya ng one step or sobrang taas, or pwede rin nating if naka-flat roof ito, so that can also be considered as elevated base plane. Okay? Next, a depressed base plane. Opposite naman ito ng elevated base plane. So from the ground, bababa ka. Okay? So it is depressed into the ground plane and utilizes the vertical surface of the lowered area to define a volume of space. Yung sinasabi natin dito na vertical surfaces, ito yan, yung mga walls. Okay? So yan yung mga vertical surfaces. Pero alam na natin, bumaba ka below ground, that's considered a depressed base plane. So other examples of this, yung mga pagbaba ng subway, basements, sunken gardens, ponds, yan. So anything that is below the ground level na na-establish. Okay, next, overhead base plane. So ang kinaibahan naman nito sa elevated base plane is located siya overhead, and it also defines a volume of space between itself and the ground plane. Open yung ilalim, mostly. Okay? So, kailangan mo pa rin ng vertical elements para ma-establish yung height niya o yung height ng elevation niya. Kailangan mo pa rin itong vertical elements. Pero, mostly open siya sa ilalim niya. So, yun yung pinakaiba niya sa elevated base plane. So, let's tackle now yung mga vertical elements. So, yung mga vertical elements naman natin composes of the following. So, vertical linear elements, single vertical plane, L-shaped plane, parallel planes, U-shaped plane, and four planes o yung closure. So, vertical linear elements, kagaya sa geometry natin, A line is defined as a point that's ongoing. So, nag-start sa point and then tumuloy-tuloy siya to one direction. Okay? So, it establishes a point on the ground and then makes it visible in space. Okay, umangat siya from one point in the ground. So, an example of that is itong obelisk. And then, pwede rin yung mga post, mga lamppost, mga colonnades. Yan, like this one. Madami sila, nakalinya sila. Okay? So, even the composition of this is linear. May kita natin dito na naka-align lang siya towards a direction. Pagdating dito, naka-curve, diba? Pero may alignment sila. So, na-establish na siya as several points with vertical elements going upward from the point in the ground. And then, single vertical plane. So, this one is the Santa Maria Novella in Florence. And most of the Renaissance buildings, ganito yung itsura. Ito yung facade nila. Pero pagdating sa likod, not necessarily ganyan din yung space. Pwedeng iba na. So, meron silang mga facade na ganito na tinatayo and then iba na yung nasa likod. So, a single vertical plane, it has its two surfaces or faces, front, on, and establish the edges of two separate and distinct spatial fields. For example, dito, it separates the outside from the inside of the building, yung nasa loob na building structure. Okay? But it's just one single vertical plane. Minsan, may mga vertical planes tayo, may mga walls tayo that are freestanding. So, iba pa yung purpose nun. Pero, by definition, it's just one vertical plane na nakatayo para magbigay ng separation between two areas or to become a face of one area and nakaharap siya dun sa isang area and then covered yung kabilang face. So, basically, it's just a single plane or a single wall or a freestanding wall. Okay. An L-shaped plane naman defines a field of space along a diagonal from its corner outward. So, basically, it's L-shaped. Pwede rin naman na ibang angle. Ito kasi, we can see itong building na to is facing at a right angle. Medyo oblique lang yung view kasi galing to sa Google Maps. But, ang L-shaped plane kasi, two sides lang yung ini-enclose niya. The rest of the sides are open. So, people can freely move dito sa open space. Pero dito sa corner, restricted na siya. And possible na may openings pa rin dito. Pero itong vertical element na to, itong walls na ito na magkadugtong, medyo nire-restrict na yung traffic through. Okay? And then, pwede rin naman na yung corners are broken. Pwedeng meron kang configuration na broken yung walls or pwede ring nag-cross sila ng ganyan or nag-intersect sila at one point, making the L shape. And then we also have yung parallel planes. Ito very common sa mga passageways, sa mga corridors, and it just influences yung direction ng traffic. So, for example dito, it's either aatras ka or magfo-forward ka going to the other end. So, much of it, itong dalawang sides na to, parallel sides, are already enclosed. Ibig sabihin, it does not influence passage going to the either side. So, you can either go forward or backward lang if you're passing through. And then, vertical element na U-shaped plane naman is open on one area only. So, meron siyang inward focus. So, makita natin dito yung mga niches sa palipaligid. So, within this chapel kasi, this is a floor plan of a chapel. Sa loob ng chapel na to, may mga niches na nakapalibot, na nakadedicate sa iba't ibang chapels pa na maliliit. So, pag pumasok ka sa loob, okay, yun nga, na-mention na nga, may inward focus. And then, there's only one way in and one way out. Very usual to dun sa mga pag nagpa-plan tayo, gusto natin na medyo solemn yung area, or if we want to somehow restrict movement going in and going out. It's also used kapag gusto natin na yan. Kasi madaming purpose yan eh. Hindi lahat ng space kailangan open on all sides or open on two sides. So, dito kasi, if you want the space to be somewhat more private and solemn, this kind of configuration of vertical elements na naka-U-shape siya, it works for that purpose. Ngayon, hindi naman strict na kailangan oval ang shape or square or rectangle yung shape. Basta the point is, tatlong walls naka-close or the rest of the walls are closed, and then there's only one opening on one side. And then, we have the most common or typical na arrangement ng apat na plane, which is a closure. So, it's the strongest type of spatial definition in architecture. So, mga bahay natin are definitely enclosed. Kasi, if you will not enclose it, kung naka-U-shape yan, yung vertical planes, and it's totally open on one side, malalesen naman yung security mo sa loob. So, it's important na merong closure itong mga planes na ito para secure din yung mga nasa loob. So, one example of this, una yung mga bahay natin, yung mga configuration ng mga buildings natin are closed on all sides, diba? And then, there are certain small openings that are allowed to break itong mga walls na ito. But typically, ito talaga yung nakalagay. 4 planes, pwedeng 5 planes, depende dun sa shape ng building nyo. It could either be curved planes. The point is, all the walls are closed. Wala kang wall na sobrang laki yung opening na nag-i-invite ng madla para pumasok sa loob. So, pwede rin naman na kahit naka-close yung 4 na walls or 4 na planes is open sa taas. Kagaya nito. So, this is a view from a courtyard going up, viewing the sky. So, pagdating dito, may opening pa rin naman siya sa taas. So, hindi mo naman mafe-feel na enclosed ka or nakakulong ka. So, lahat ng mga spaces na yan, may function and may purpose. So, depende sa purpose ng space mo, kaya mo gagamitin yan. But these are the options that we can choose from. This lecture is brought to you by, ito yung mga references natin. So, it's mostly based on Francis D.K. Ching's Architecture, Form, Space, and Order. And several of the examples are the ones that I've chosen from the internet and from past lectures. So, okay, I hope you learned a lot from this lecture. Kung meron kayong mga tanong, there will be a form for your activity. So, sana masagutan nyo yan. And I'll also allot a space there if you have any questions or queries regarding this topic. So, our next topic will be about openings within spaces. So, nabanggit na natin yung form and yung space. Ngayon, paano naman mag-i-introduce ng light and ventilation doon sa loob, and what are the implications ng mga openings doon sa buildings natin or doon sa forms, what will change and how it will affect the form and the users of the building inside. So, thank you for listening. Thank you for watching this video. At kung meron kayong mga tanong, please comment or react on this video. I'm looking forward to those questions. So, thank you. Please stay safe.